So I recently developed this pretty neat felt geometry node setup for this frog character I made, and I thought since some of you asked me to have a breakdown of it, I should make this quick video to explain how it works. Now in this video, I'll be actually working you through this tool I made that's on Gumroad. You can just grab it in the link in the description, but if you don't want to buy it, I'll anyway still explain the process, and with a bit of work you should be able to get a system working nicely for you. So this is what you'll have straight out of the box after getting the tool. You'll see the viewport on the left, the geometry nodes on the upper right, material setup down here, and then you'll have the curve editor on the bottom. So I'll start off explaining the node graph that you can see here and explain how the whole effect works. This is kind of where the whole magic begins. You want to start off by creating different types of curves to instance on the mesh. So I used to have actual curve meshes in my scene, but I ended up making them procedurally to have less clutter and more just adjustable settings. And yeah, I mean, there's some that are more wavy and straight, and other that are more like curly and like balls, so it's kind of up to you. You can play around with the settings, but the default settings will work, and if you're modeling them from scratch, just keep that in mind. But for this tool, I made them mostly using the pre-existing Blender head tools, and then those curves, they get scattered on the mesh. So ignore this animation bit, it's a bit complicated. I'll explain to you later how the whole animation pipeline works, but for now, let's just concentrate on this. So you'll find a setting for the density and then a separate one for the viewport density, so you don't like kill your PC. And if you go in the actual node group, yeah, you'll find here that I created some options to have holdouts. So either objects or collections, and they kind of act as masks for the scattering. So for example, I used that on these button eyes for my frog model. I didn't want to have any threads clipping in through it, so I just kind of used the button eyes as holdouts for the scattering. The only thing you might find yourself needing to adjust after you set up a holdout would be this color ramp, and if required, the distance in the geometry proximity, as that's very dependent on the scale of your scene and the different object. And then there's a bit more node magic, but if you go out of here, you'll find that there's some unique settings per types of curves. So you'll have unique scale and density for every type, but you probably won't have to ever change that. And that's pretty much straightforward from there on, just joining everything, adding a bit of random rotation, random scale, then yeah, the radius, the material, and just different optimizations. And now, if you look over at the geometry nodes panel, you'll find a few other exposed parameters, like this viewport hide tick box. That helps a lot with frame rate issues if you just want to hide everything out the viewport, if you have too many things that have felt on them. And then, yeah, the overall hair scale, some thickness adjustments, and the overall samples for every curve of felt. And then you just have your material slot here to change to whichever material you want to use. Under that, you'll see this whole animation tab, and after that, this whole extra tab. So this tab is kind of where I put all the specific settings, like the holdout that I've already mentioned, but there's also this camera culling option, where you kind of select first the camera that you're using, and then if you enable the culling, you will see that if I move the camera, you can see how some of it is kind of getting removed outside of the camera view. And so you want to adjust your aspect ratio. Right now, I've just set it to 1:1 because I'm working on a squared thing, but you can just adjust it to your 16:9 ratio, whatever you kind of use. And in order to get a better idea, you can tick the show sensor, and that will kind of enable you to exactly specify how it looks like. And then you have your camera focal length, where you can either just copy paste the value that it currently is at, or if you want to be a little extra, you can actually go into your camera that you're using, and here if you right click, you can copy it as a new driver, and then if you go back to your modifier, you can paste it there, and that will kind of just take whatever the value is, even if you're animating it, if you're doing like a focal pull or any changes to your camera. And then you have this general padding setting that can help just getting the correct look that you want. And after that, you'll find this LOD section that allows you to have different sampling for the curve depending on how far it is from the camera view. And you do have this distance and gradient sort of settings that you can play with to get the look that you want, but the issue is I kept it experimental because the only way I found out how to make this whole effect was to realize the instances, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of working with instances and makes the whole scene a bit slower. So unless you're aware of a way to do it that's a bit better, I don't recommend using it because it might slow down the overall performances. But yeah, and so now the only thing that's left to explain is the kind of highlight of the whole geometry system for me, the animation tab. So you'll notice first that there's a kind of general setting for the stepped animation, and there you can specify how often you want the felt to be animated. So you can keep it at 0 if you just want it to be set, but if you want a bit of movement in it that kind of replicates that stop motion look where every other frame or every 3 or 4 frame the felt gets moved just naturally because of the actual real life touch of the animators on the real life puppets, you can set it here, and you can even put decimals behind it like 2.5 where every 2 frames the felt will be animated, but not exactly 2 frames. And I think that kind of helps set a bit of like imperfection in the animation and kind of break up the stepped animation exclusively on 2 or on 3s. But what's more important is you'll notice under that there's a general/local setting, and that kind of allows you to specify whether you want the entire mesh to be animated. So that is the general option, but you also have this local one where it allows you to specify the areas that are getting deformed by the animation. So in order for Blender to know what areas are actually getting deformed, you will have to create a duplicate of the object when you've finished animating it, and then you want to delay that animation by whatever the stepped animation is set to. So you'll notice, actually, if you take a look at the curve editor here, you'll notice that there's a stepped modifier on the animation, and that allows whatever procedural way of animating or rigged deformation to be stepped on 2s and give that whole object a look of stop motion puppet. And in order to make that, you can just go to the add modifier and you'll find this stepped setting. But what could be useful is actually getting the Stop Mo add-on. It's a free add-on that allows you to just set how much you want it to be stepped by, and it will add it to every curves that's on your object, which can be really useful when you deal with rigged animated mesh, such as that frog example, where you don't want to go through every single one of the curves and add that modifier. You can just click the button and it will add onto all the curves just for you, and then you can, if you want to turn it off or on specific curves, you can just go in and turn them off. And you'll also notice how the delayed duplicate is not visible in camera, and it doesn't have the actual felt modifier on it. That's very important, otherwise it won't work. So you want your duplicate to be the absolute final animated mesh, excluding the felt effect. But so you'll always deal with a duplicate if you want that local deformation to be taken into consideration. And then if you go back to your original object, you can tick that local deformed debug option and get a feel for how deformed it is. So it's going to look black and white. And essentially, the black areas are the areas that are not getting deformed and that won't have any animation to them, whereas the white areas will be the areas that will get completely changed around. And you can just adjust this deformation fall off to kind of enhance or not, depending on how your animation is, what areas are getting deformed. So that's very specific on your object, the scale of everything, and the amount of deformation that your animation creates. And by that point, you should have a pretty convincing animated felt toy or object in your viewport. And the only thing that's left to explain really now is the whole material setup. So you'll see that you're by default assigned this felt material, And if we go to that tab, you'll find the felt material as a node group, and then an example for the two kind of texturing workflows. One relying on image texture, so you can see I just used the default Blender UV grid, and the other one being this procedural shading, where I just used this wave texture to kind of show that it works whether you use image texture or procedural. And you can of course combine both ways of working, and you can add, like if I go here and I add a mapping node, you can see that I can adjust my image texture and everything will work in real time. And then if you go into the felt material, you'll see it mostly relies on a lot of subsurface and noise and just overall organic sort of shifts in hues and values to give it really like a realistic look to it all. And then I also exposed the subsurface parameter if you don't want to go into the material itself. And yeah, you'll notice how I'm actually making the value a lot darker than it really is because of the subsurface. That's going to bring a lot of light in your mesh, so you do want to keep that in mind, that you might have to make your image texture that you're using or your noise that you're using a lot darker than you would think you need. And then yeah, I mean, this is a cycle-based material, but you can use it in Eevee. You might have to just take on ambient occlusion and play around with different settings in the material itself, such as how much you're mixing black in your final texture, or in the parameters of Eevee to make it look extra nice. But you won't really have the same realism as Cycles. Cycles really, especially for felt, is where you'll have the biggest difference, because it has that ray tracing and that added realism to it that you do want when you're dealing with felt. And yeah, I mean, because this is a whole instance workflow, it's actually surprisingly fast to edit the viewport with and kind of just play around with the values. It's never going to take too long. You can see that the whole geometry node setup only takes about 19 milliseconds to compute, which is pretty quick, especially considering that you're dealing with a lot of actual geometry, but it's not calculated because it stays as instances. So that's surprisingly fast. And yeah, that kind of wraps up this whole tool, kind of how to use it. Again, the link is in the description if you want to get it. It would really mean the world to me. Again, this is the only time I've published something, so if you have any problem with it, feel free to message me. And if there's any bugs or anything, I'll be here to correct it, because I do genuinely use this tool quite a lot for my own creations. So hopefully it will only get better with time. Feel free to send me any creations that you end up making with this felt tool. And I'll also put some links in the description if you want to build your own tool. I'll put some links to tutorials that have camera culling, deformation of the meshes, and other approaches to felt. I'll try to stay on top with the new versions and make it even sort of more optimized and more efficient with the newest release of Blender. But yeah, that's kind of it. So have fun creating some felt characters, and that's it. Thank you for watching. Bye!